Greetings, folks. I hope your reading's going well. I'd been wondering what to talk about today because I spent a fair bit of time talking about the actual book last time out, and I really don't think lecturing about literature is the way to study literature. We're at a bit of a disadvantage right now, given how we have to conduct class. So what I'll probably do is not talk every time out about the book itself, but address some other idea that I hope you can actually apply to the book, whatever book we happen to be reading. Today, I think I'll talk a little bit about Romanticism. Many of you are probably familiar with it, but the levels of students in the class range from second up to fourth year, so I can't assume everybody's familiar with all the major currents. Accordingly, Romanticism is the topic of today's little talk, and next time out, for the last talk on Jane Eyre, I think I'll return to the text itself and probably talk a bit about colonialism as well. Of course, we can't talk about the Romantic period without discussing at least a little bit the Enlightenment, as Romanticism was primarily a response to, and in some ways a rejection of, Enlightenment values. The Enlightenment, of course, is also known as the Age of Reason, and was itself a development coming out of Renaissance humanism. The age embraced the scientific revolution, and with it, a rational understanding of the cosmos, or even a mechanistic understanding of the cosmos. And following Newton's publication of Mathematica Principia in 1687, many thinkers embraced a model generally known as the clockwork universe, with God as a clockmaker who had made the universe, set it all in motion according to specific rules, and then effectively just buggered off. This is also the time of some of the foundational political and economic theories that would define the modern age. Free market capitalism, for example, modern democracy, and first-wave feminism. It's always struck me that free market capitalism bears a number of similarities to notions of the clockwork universe, with the system just set up and then allowed to run according to whatever rules are in place when the system starts going. As for the political theories, these are based upon largely a rational critique of received authority, subjecting, for example, the inherited aristocratic hierarchies and the inherited gender hierarchies to critique against such measurable things as human capacity. It's during the Enlightenment that we see the rise of the discourse of human rights in the West, for example, and notions of the universal claim to freedom of, for instance, belief, expression, movement, congregation. So, while there is much about the Enlightenment that I think can and should be criticized, there's much as well that I think is genuinely admirable. On the other hand, from a romantic point of view, the Enlightenment was a very stodgy or constrained period. It embraced a general approach to culture called Classicism, or if you prefer, Neoclassicism, which is basically the belief that one's own time has found the greatest possible wisdom, the most useful possible way of looking at and understanding the world, and that therefore the ways that other cultures and other times may have found ought to be subject to one's own standards. Examples of classicist periods are the Golden Age of Athens, of course, the Augustan period in Rome, and, as we're discussing, the Enlightenment period in England, or Europe generally speaking. As far as literature or the arts generally were concerned, there is a tendency toward rational construction, balance, control, form, an emphasis on wit, and a tendency to write about so-called high characters, aristocratic or heroic subjects, particularly in poetry. Pope, for example, held that good poetry was a copy of nature, which meant that it was a copy of the best composers of the past. So there's an emphasis on learning, on other classical periods, and on control of the passions. Great English prose writers of the time include Daniel Defoe, Jonathan Swift, and Henry Fielding, And of course, Samuel Johnson, author of Rasselas and compiler of the first English dictionary. In Jane Eyre, the spirituality adopted by Helen Burns is largely an Enlightenment-type spirituality, a bringing of her own passions under control and under the authority of a single overriding commitment to understanding and truth, a bringing of her own psyche into alignment with the workings of the universe as she understands it. She is largely stoical, of course, and understandably so given her circumstances. But Stoicism itself is a body of thought that fits in very well with the overall outlook of the Enlightenment period. But of course, Romanticism is not that. Thinkers and writers of the Romantic period found the doctrine or dogma of reason to be constraining and, in fact, at times quite myopic. And while they didn't reject reason utterly, they were consciously open to other ways of approaching the world and of understanding the world and their experience of it. In this sense, there wasn't a single truth, but rather a diversity of truth and a diversity of ways of coming at it, of approaching or understanding it. There was an embracing of emotion and intuition, really sort of a rehabilitation of these things, after they had been largely discredited by the Enlightenment as inferior ways of knowing or inferior ways of understanding relative to reason. Wordsworth, for example, famously in his preface to Lyrical Ballads in 1798, describes poetry as an outflowing of powerful emotion recollected in tranquility. And rather than write about noble or heroic characters, he and Romantic poets generally chose to write about modest subjects, modest settings, everyday people. There was, in this period, an elevation of the everyday, or rather a recognition of the everyday, as being worthy of consideration, worthy of art. And along with this line of thinking, there was a glorification of the rustic or the rural, as opposed to the urban or urbane, a sense that the sophistication of city life was in some sense a corruption of the purer or more natural human being. And this isn't to say that rural experience was sanitized or caricaturized. There seems to have been a genuine attempt to appreciate, to understand what the life of people living in these rustic or rural circumstances was like, and to find or recognize poetry, for instance, in their day-to-day existence. My favorite example of this is Wordsworth's poem Resolution and Independence, which tells the story of a leech gatherer. Leeches, of course, were essential to what passed at the time for medicine, so there was quite a demand for the thirsty little suckers, and somebody had to gather them. Well, the job of a leech gatherer, always the job of a poor person, was basically this. You find a pool of still water, you walk out into the pool with your legs bare, and you stand there, and you stand there, and you stand there. And then when you come out, with any luck, you're covered in leeches. You pluck the leeches off, put them in a jar, and then go back in and repeat the process. And this is how you make a living, basically using your blood as bait for blood-sucking worms, so that people with more money than you can be healthy. Speaking of blood-sucking worms, but onward. And while such a character would have been beneath the notice or perhaps even beneath the contempt of many a poet in the Enlightenment period, Wordsworth saw exactly in that figure a worth and a dignity that demanded to be expressed in poetry. That is, Romantic poetry, Romantic literature largely, tended to have a deeply rooted democratizing impulse and a commitment to elevating the politically and socially humble that was not merely aesthetic but political in itself, in that it brought the circumstances of poor or marginalized people to the public consciousness. Further, The approach to poetry, or the arts in general, was quite different from that in the Enlightenment. Whereas Enlightenment writers tended to see poetry as an acquisition, the Romantics tended to present it as a gift of nature, a result of inspiration, often very intense inspiration. So this is the age of the artist as isolated, inspired genius, and of art as revelation of an inner life that may not be accessible by other means or expressible by other means. In fact, this is where we get that particular cultural myth. Think of Rochester looking over Jane's sketches and discussing her inspiration with her, or think of the sketches themselves as revelations or portraits of her own psyche. And along with the recognition of the legitimacy of the experience of the poor, of course, comes a concern for their well-being. This is an age of increasing humanitarianism, much of it expressed through charitable organizations coming out of various churches. In terms of philosophers, probably the most important thinker of the period, at least in terms of the understanding of human nature, was Jean-Jacques Rousseau. The Romantic period embraced the notion of the innate goodness of humanity, as opposed to the innate selfishness of people described in the political philosophies of Thomas Hobbes or John Locke, the principal political philosophers of the Enlightenment. Whereas Hobbes, for example, sees human beings as vicious and selfish and in need of being contained or constrained by strict laws strictly enforced, Rousseau sees us as naturally good or virtuous and tending to be corrupted by the artifices of life in civilization. It's this thinking of Rousseau that lies largely behind the valorization of the rural and the natural in Romantic literature. The Romantic period was also a period that witnessed and responded to a number of revolutions. One of these, of course, is the Industrial Revolution, itself an outgrowth of the Scientific Revolution and the Enlightenment drive toward rational organization on the one hand, and free enterprise on the other. It's arguably the Industrial Revolution that lies behind the final dethroning of the aristocracy as the dominant power in industrialized nations. It's the Industrial Revolution as well that lies behind or at least much of the colonial impulse sweeping European nations at the time. And I'll have more to say about that in the next talk. In terms of its relationship to Romanticism, though, one thing we might consider is the mechanization of work, the effective turning of the human being into a cog in a much larger machine, or in other words, an impersonal and replaceable part. The production of many consumer goods, for example textiles, went from being a skilled or artisan craft to the operation of a power loom driven by a steam engine. Workers, in that sense, lost any sense of organic connection to the things that they were making or the things that they were doing, and thus the production of consumer goods became more or less a type of drudgery. Hours were long, over 12 hours a day regularly, sometimes as many as 16. Pay was low as the factory owners could manage, and with workers not able to organize, England banned trade unions, the factory owners were able to get away with paying, I would say, subsistence wages, but in some cases not even that much. Conditions were unsafe, injuries common, and assistance for the injured or otherwise unemployed non-existent, with the exception of charitable organizations, as I said before, largely run by the various churches. This period saw mass movements of population from rural to urban areas for some pretty obvious reasons. Factories are expensive to set up, so only people with money can do that. So this is the rise of the upper middle class, the bourgeoisie, as Marx called them. And because factory-produced goods are so much cheaper than artisan goods, the factories effectively outcompeted the cottage industries, which had been the staple of European nations prior to industrialization. So people who had once spent their early life learning a craft and then spent the rest of their life doing that craft in the place where they learned it, in their village or town or what have you, mostly village, were forced basically to leave where they were from and move into the cities because the industry in the cities and the large factory towns had basically put them out of work. So there is at this time a collapse of cottage industry in industrializing nations, with a corresponding collapse in social ties and the strength of local communities. And with that, a complete disruption of the society, the social structures, and the social protection structures, the sense of organic connectedness that had grown up around that industry, or rather those industries. And instead what we see is the rise of urban industrial slums, disgusting places, worse than any slum I think that exists in North America or Western Europe today. Places typified by overcrowding, lack of sanitation, shoddy construction, rapid spread of disease, and unsurprisingly, given the misery of the people living in them, rampant substance abuse, particularly hard liquor, particularly gin. This is a period, as I mentioned before, of what we now call wage slavery. People had to work, but even working 12 to 16 hours a day, 6 days a week, could barely afford to survive. There were no protections for children at the time, so very young children often found that they had to go to work in the factories or as chimney sweepers because there simply weren't the means to send them to school or even to keep food in their stomachs unless they themselves worked. And it's largely against the backdrop of this basically nightmare vision of a city that the Romantic thinkers and artists held up the rural as an ideal. And speaking of ideals, we should probably say something about the American and French revolutions, the two political revolutions that were central to the thought and experience of the Romantic period. Like the Industrial Revolution, both of these revolutions were outgrowths of Enlightenment thought, particularly in this case Enlightenment political philosophy, with its challenges to received authority, its notions of innate human equality, and its demand that any regime be rationally justifiable to those over whom it has power. The American motto, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and the French motto, liberté, égalité, fraternité, sum up the political thought, or much of the political thought, lying behind these revolutions. Both involved a casting off of a monarchy or an aristocracy, and the establishment of secular constitutions. That is, constitutions not relying on religious authority for the legitimacy, but rather on the consent of the governed, at least in theory, as well as on separation of church and state. Of course, both of these revolutions violently threw off monarchical rule, in one case separating from a colonial power, and in the other case putting an end to the ruling family and the aristocracy as a whole. And the French Revolution in particular completely transformed Europe, leading as it did to the rise of Napoleon and the Napoleonic Wars, which, by the time they concluded in 1815, constituted the largest armed conflicts in European history prior to the First World War. Many Romantics embraced the ideals of the French Revolution. Wordsworth, in fact, went to Paris in 1792 to witness the new regime, but found himself fleeing the country rather rapidly when the terror broke out. A very disillusioned young man. And, as we'll see in a moment, the figure of Napoleon himself plays an important role in the later Romantic consciousness. When we turn to more explicitly literary concerns, and this certainly carries through to the age of the Brontes, we see a rise in interest in myth and symbolism, as opposed, for example, to allegory. which had been one of the preferred modes of Enlightenment literature. And this development makes sense. From a rational point of view, allegory is a great idea because one thing corresponds to another thing. The correspondence is clear and can be clearly identified, and once it is identified, you have a key to how to read the text. Symbols, on the other hand, are often multivalent or polyvalent. They can mean more than one thing, and sometimes multiple things at once. And this, of course, leaves them much more open to interpretation and puts much more of the responsibility then for engaging the text or understanding the text on the reader. The reader is not merely trying to discern what the writer meant, but different readers might come up with different readings, and these can both be perfectly and equally legitimate. That is, there's an implied challenge to any singular authority simply in adopting symbols that are open to multiple interpretations. I'm thinking now of a wonderful passage from Wordsworth's poem Tintern Abbey, with which he concludes lyrical ballads. Therefore I am still a lover of the meadows and the woods and the mountains, and of all that we behold from this green earth, of all the mighty world of eye and ear, both what they half create and what perceive, well pleased to recognize in nature and the language of the sense, the anchor of my purest thoughts, the nurse, the guide, the guardian of my heart, and soul of all my moral being. Now, those of you who've read Tintern Abbey will recall that it focuses on Wordsworth's second visit to a lovely idyllic spot along the River Wye, and his awareness of changes in himself relative to the last time he was there. That is, the focus is not so much on understanding the place or describing the place as on the construction of the place through himself, and also the construction of himself through the place. This role of the self in understanding is wonderfully illustrated by Wordsworth's image of the eye and the ear both half creating and perceiving that which they encounter. That is, there's on the one hand a recognition that there is an objective world out there, as of course the Enlightenment would hold, but also that our understanding, our knowing, our experience of that world can only ever be mediated through our encounter with it, that we can never be completely objective, but we're always embedded in whatever scene, in whatever place we happen to be observing. And the notion that we half construct what we perceive is a recognition, among other things, that we're not just taking in sensory data, but rather filtering that input through whatever categories of thought we're carrying around in our heads. And these are going to be different for everyone. And it's in this interaction with the world that Wordsworth sees the construction of the self, and not just an emotional self, but a moral self. That is, morality as well, ethics as well, are bound up not in some appeal to an objective or absolute reality, but in our interactions with the reality that we encounter. The reality is there, but the encounter is real, and the encounter matters too. What this role of perception in the creation of both identity and understanding means necessarily is a rejection of master narratives, be they political or religious in orientation. That is, what we see in Romantic literature and Romantic thought generally is a rise of the individual to a degree of prominence quite beyond what it attained in Enlightenment philosophy or literature. This is the age of the self, not just as a made thing, but quite genuinely as a work of art. And when we turn more to the mythic side of things, we also see during this period the rise of interest in folklore, in the recovery of folk tales, in understanding the narratives of rural people passed down by word of mouth over centuries. This is the impetus behind the work of the Brothers Grimm, for example, and many other folklore and folktale collectors, in whose minds they weren't merely collecting information, collecting data, but they were collecting narratives, collecting stories, songs, practices associated with the land, associated with the people on the land. That is, there's a conscious tying of local narrative and local people to the land, and a desire to discover, and sometimes even a desire, I think, to forge an organic link between them. On the political side, we see the rise of Romantic nationalism, which had some rather nasty consequences. But on the other, we see a tendency to stand, or the ability to stand on local tradition, on local narrative, on inherited word-of-mouth myth and legend, as an alternative to the dominant narrative, for example, of Christianity, which many of the folklorists saw as essentially a foreign import where the cultures of Northern Europe were concerned. This movement, this notion, is certainly present in the work of the Brontes, as we've already seen and as we'll certainly see when we get to Wuthering Heights. But as I mentioned before, this is the age of the self as object of contemplation and object of cultivation, of thing to be made. And to give you an example of exactly what I mean, I'll turn one more time to Wordsworth. In 1799, Wordsworth published a long poem in 2 books called Prelude, Growth of a Poet's Mind. It was about himself. And that's fine, autobiographical writing is nothing new. But in 1805, he published a revised and expanded version of it in 12 books, an epic, titled The Prelude, Growth of a Poet's Mind, an epic about himself as big, roughly, as Paradise Lost. But wait, there's more. In 1850, the same year he died, he published another revised and expanded version, 13 books, of The Prelude, Growth of a Poet's Mind. And while I'm being a little facetious in my presentation, he actually had a very serious purpose behind what he was doing in presenting an epic about himself. What Wordsworth is doing is presenting the self, the individual, as worthy of being the subject of an epic, presenting the growth of an individual person, the development of an individual character, as worthy of being held on the same level as the perpetual conflict between good and evil. And this does make sense, doesn't it? In a world in which the individual both perceives and constructs the world in which they live, then that struggle between good and evil, if you want to call it that, can only ever happen in the individual. It's an individualized thing. The individual psyche is the locus of the conflict, of any conflict, of all conflict. So why not have an epic about that? This is, in its own way, the same gesture, the same logic lying behind poems like Resolution and Independence with the Leech Gatherer. And this brings us around to a couple of archetypes that are worth addressing. The first one is the Romantic Hero. This literary figure is, of course, very individualistic. That goes with the territory. And tends to have an introspective, melancholy bent. He or she often does not fit well into social situations and can actually prefer to be alone, very often, in fact, does, and is quite often rejected by society in any case. The character also tends to reject external definition, insisting on defining him or herself on his or her own terms. And in this sense, we can see Jane, I think, fairly clearly. Much of her narrative is taken up with other people trying to overwrite what she sees as herself, and her own assertions, often very quiet and internal, that those definitions are wrong, that they're unjust, that they're wide of the mark. The attempt to inscribe a hellfire Christianity on her, for example, when she sees herself, and Rochester sees her, as more of a fairy tale figure. The attempt to inscribe the label of dishonest on her, when she is in fact extremely honest. Even the question of what her last name is going to be, when she's engaged to Rochester. It's worth noting as well that it's in the Romantic period that Milton's Satan comes to be seen as the hero of the poem, as Byron held him to be, specifically because he fought a battle he knew he was going to lose against an omnipotent power. He asserted his individuality, he asserted himself against what he saw as a tyrannical authority. Prometheus is another figure who was generally seen as heroic in the Romantic period. And for similar reasons, his opposition to Zeus and subsequent punishment in order to carry out what he thought was a good act is something, quite frankly, I've always admired. I love Prometheus. But this too is an assertion of an individual's moral character, an individual's moral compass against even the highest divine authority. This is something to be respected from the Romantic point of view. And finally, there of course is the figure of Napoleon, who on the one hand was seen as this consummate individual, this person who had the strength to assert his own character in such a way that he reshaped an entire continent. But on the other, someone who did fall as a result of his own greatness, but was still somehow great in his fall. Byron in particular wrestled with the figure of Napoleon for his entire life, and largely for those reasons. And as a final note, I should probably say something about a subtype of the Romantic hero, the Byronic hero, developed, as the name indicates, by Byron, particularly in the figure of his character Manfred. The Byronic hero tends to meet the criteria of the Romantic hero, but also tends to have a darker psyche and to be more brooding. Often the figure has not just a mysterious, but also a dubious past, often morally dubious. There is a hint in the Byronic hero of not just emotional darkness, but of genuine moral darkness. These are also emotionally forceful figures. They tend to, even without saying much, be the dominant figure in whichever situation they find themselves in. That is, there is a quiet and brooding and in many ways seductive strength to them. Very much, for instance, as there is with the Gothic villain, a figure with which the Byronic hero also has a fair bit in common. Just as their looming or lurking moral darkness, combined with their attractiveness, can bring them into alignment with Milton's Satan, whom we were just discussing, and who does seem to be implicitly present in at least some characters who fit this description. These characters are often rather solipsistic, self-interested, showing perhaps the darker side of romantic individualism and the moral depths that it may well open if taken to its extreme. There's a tendency for them to build worlds around them in their own image rather than engage the external world on the external world's own terms. This is a part of their strength. They are able to do that. And I think this is also part of their attraction. There are characters in all three of the Bronte novels we're looking at who could be described as Byronic heroes. I'll leave it to you to figure out who they are and which one most closely fits the bill. I will say, quite frankly, that Anne's treatment of this figure is the one that I actually find most interesting. And I do hope when we get to that book, you enjoy the character. Now though, as this is a little late getting up, as in it should have been up yesterday, I should probably stop talking and edit my last sound clip and post it. I will try to be a little more prompt with the next one, at least to get it up on the day that it's supposed to be up. I think in the next talk I'll want to address colonialism in some measure because, of course, Jane Eyre is explicitly concerned with that endeavor. And as this talk didn't say much about the novel, and as the next one is the last talk we'll be having on Jane Eyre, it will be a little more text-oriented than this one has been. Thanks very much for listening, and I hope you found this useful. Bye for now.